So what we're going to talk about today is less Bjarke's work, although we can definitely get to that later if those questions come up, but more about one of the things that comes up a lot in interviews with Bjarke is that you went to architecture school because you couldn't go to school to become a comic book illustrator. And so, even in conversations that we've had about things like Inception and other sorts of sci-fi scenarios, I thought it would be interesting to bring you here to talk not about architecture as such, but to talk more about that aspect of your interests, the comic book environments that you wanted to draw, that inspired you, the science fiction that you might be reading now, the films and the film sets that give you ideas or that you are repelled by, and so forth. So I'd love to just start off with that notion of when you were hoping to become a comic book writer, was it an architectural interest that brought you to comic books, or was it a narrative interest in certain storylines? And if so, what were those storylines, or what were the kinds of environments and settings that you wanted to use?
It was actually I think paradoxically my interests sort of shifted, but until I ended up at the Royal Danish Art Academy, I was purely interested in the drawings. Actually, I was drawing all the time, and I tried at one point to make a story when I was in high school, but it was so clearly driven by the desire to draw cool images that the story sucked so badly that I got this feedback from the comic book guru in Denmark, because he could see that I was relatively young. So he wanted to not discourage me, but he was really saying, great work on the graphics, but you should really work on on a plot, basically. And then ever since I enrolled in architecture school, I practically haven't drawn ever since, and I got really interested in the stories and the narratives. And our first company was called Plot. This idea how the way you structure certain ingredients almost in a narrative way can actually create images and spaces and sensations. I think so since then my interests have actually sort of slided maybe more towards literature and science fiction than comics. And I think one of the main parallels between architecture and science fiction to me is Philip K. Dick's definition of science fiction, which I think is quite instrumental. Which is, he says that science fiction is not a space opera. It's not a story from the future. It's a story where the plot is triggered by some sort of innovation. It can be often a technological, but also a cultural, or political, or social innovation. And the whole story is a narrative exploration of the potential of that idea. And not only the author, but also the reader can philosophize on the potential consequences that sort of trickles through society when you change one single ingredient, what happens to the rest of the ecosystem. And that's essentially the recipe we try to use, or the method we try to use when we do architecture, is to try to read through the material to see if there is some potential for doing one thing differently. And then the whole design process becomes a design exploration of the potential and the potential consequences of this one innovation.
I was saying that I wanted to avoid talking about architecture, just to take the bait. Can you just give an example of what you're talking about, where you, for instance, in mountain dwellings where you stick the parking lot underneath the house, or what is the type of spatial innovation that you see as having a narrative impact on the future sequences of living that might take place in that building?
Yeah, but I think sort of it's quite simple. Let's you take a mountain, or maybe the 8 house. Let's say the 8 house, it was this idea of, it's a building we built in Copenhagen where we mix shops and offices with residential programs. And we got this idea that maybe we could introduce some of the informal encounters that you have in, for instance, townhouse neighborhoods, where the little front lawn actually allows the creation of community, and to put that into a dense urban context. So we're exploring the difference in floor depths that the commercial spaces are deeper than residential spaces, to actually get space for a little path and little gardens in front of these townhouses. and gradually to see if we can actually get these townhouses all the way to the penthouse and back down again. And just like this one idea of trying to introduce the townhouse in a dense urban setting triggers all these consequences that require solutions, and that as a consequence create new spaces or new kind of encounters or new shapes that we're actually not inventing. We're simply sort of stumbling upon them, trying to resolve them the best way possible to achieve our main plot. So basically, the whole design process and all the results in architecture and all the shapes, and in this case, like it has this kind of sort of uncertain kind of formal language. I normally compare it to more like a Stephen Hall kind of building, because it has like all these little moves, and it has nothing to do with an aesthetic that we've sort of imposed, but simply a question of trying to get people on their bicycles and with their baby strollers from the street to the penthouse and back down again in one piece. So it's that sort of idea. And I think maybe the one place where we really sort of started interacting with science fiction was we did this project for Audi, where we tried to apply a Kurzweilian, Ray Kurzweil kind of perspective on things. I think as a thinker, he manages to sort of bridge the gap between science and science fiction more than anyone, because like he projects so far into he sort of takes current tendencies and his general sort of idea of exponential sort of exponential development and innovation, or like a constant acceleration in the pace of innovation, and just projects it into the future, making things that are practically unimaginable and utopian today seem highly practical and quite feasible when you look at his graphs, at least. And I think quite often architects, and especially urbanists, that, you know, an urban project quite often has like a 40-year timeline. We're doing a master plan for Copenhagen that takes place in 2050. That's sort of the end vision. And paradoxically, urbanists are almost the most conservative of all the architects, because like they try to sort of perpetuate urban situations that they can observe, that function, and then try to replicate them. Whereas if you're dealing with something that is 40 years into the future, more than anyone, you should really be going nuts, because with the sort of progressive development of technological evolution, things that would be like considered highly psychedelic today would be quite feasible in 4 years.
Can you just briefly describe the Audi project, because it's quite interesting, reimagining. It's almost more like a science fictional scenario for future intersections. And can you just give us sort of like a really brief description of the summer plots of the future?
Yeah, we were sort of looking at we were asked to look at the future of cities, and of course, since we were commissioned by Audi, we thought we might like take a look at cars. And there was like this one thing about Audi that's interesting, is that their slogan in German at least is Vorsprung durch Technik, so it talks about technology instead of cars. And just looking at, we applied this sort of Kurzweilian perspective on mobilities, and since the invention of the wheel, there's been like a constant acceleration in paradigm changes in the way we move around. But the last 20, 30 years, and there's like been a higher frequency of innovations, but for the last 20 years, they don't really deal so much with what propels the vehicle, but with what maneuvers the vehicle. And over the last 20 years, like in 1998, there was like 8 cars driving 5,000 miles without a driver in them. They sort of sealed off a stretch of highway. They were driving very densely together. I think in 2000 and was it 7 or something, like the first DARPA challenge was successfully completed with a driverless car driving through like some 100 miles of desert. And I think last year Google announced that they'd actually been having these Google cars driving driverless around the San Francisco Bay Area. Leading Eric Schmidt to say that he couldn't understand that human beings were even allowed to drive cars at all. Because, you know, humans are distracted. They're like, at least half of the humans are really poor multitaskers. and we're easily distracted by all kinds of other things. Whereas, so like 99% of all car accidents and fatal car accidents are due to human error. So we just looked at it. It looks very obvious that within even 5 to 10 years, cars will become driverless. They'll become pollutionless because fuel cells and batteries don't emit gases, and they'll become noiseless because there's no combustion engine, there's no explosions, and then there's no noise. And then we started looking at what could be the implication of the driverless car. And cars are very convenient in the suburbs and in the countryside, but in the cities they cause traffic jams, they cause congestion, they frustrate the people that are stuck in them. So we thought instead of having the traditional congestion tax, basically when you drive into the inner city, your manual override is disengaged, and your individually driven car starts behaving in a sort of collectively coordinated concert with all the other cars. So basically, the individual driven cars becomes collectively coordinated, and feels instead of the way you can then sort of resolve traffic jams is that since the central nervous system of the city knows where everybody's going, you can sort of guide all the different cars through the different streets as a way of expanding car capacity by simply maybe reversing directions of streets spontaneously. And also, instead of casting the functions of the city in concrete, you can actually allow the public realm to expand and contract. So instead of proportioning the car domain for peak loads, you can actually sort of allow social programs to pop up in the middle of the city. I went to Hanoi in Vietnam, where I guess because of the Vietnamese culture, they get up at 4 or 5 in the morning and play badminton and do gymnastics in the middle of the car lane. That requires a certain sort of discipline that the rest of us probably don't have. But in the future, this could be a plausible scenario that the space of the city could really expand and contract. So we try to sort of take these ideas and take them sort of one step further and really look at these massive impacts on the way we use and occupy our cities that could be created not from architecture but from technological breakthroughs.
Well, I'm curious to combine that with your previous answer and ask about the kind of the medium and the format through which you articulate these ideas. And so, just anecdotally, I interviewed a guy a few years ago who is a video game environment designer, and he made a really interesting comment, which was that he thought of going into architecture, but the things he wanted to design were Japanese pagodas that were 75 stories tall, and there were these fantastical kind of video game environments that if you did that at GSAT, or if you did that at Yale or Princeton, you'd be flunked immediately. It would be called kitsch, and none of your professors would talk to you again.
Not anymore.
Well, I think it's still pretty close, actually. But so I guess I'm curious about the notion that if there's certain types of architecture that are more appropriate for science fiction and novels and comic books and so on. But then there's this kind of architecture that's accepted. But then there's this vision of using architecture as a genre and using architecture as a way to talk about radical notions of if you had written a science fiction novel that described everything that you just said, that sounds like a kind of straightforward science fiction novel. Or the setting for one. So anyway, my question is, how do you navigate the distinction between an architectural proposal and urban futures, and the kind of compunction to go in a narrative direction and actually, direct a film with Steven Spielberg, or to write a screenplay that is more important than a build?
I mean, I think. Just to dodge the question for 1 second, you just mentioned the game designer. Because actually we had an interesting moment. I think our first venture into the sort of imaginary world. It's very very parallel. The first competition we won when we started our office was a design for a swimming pool in Copenhagen. And it was we sort of stretched the big swimming basin out into a long canal, and then sort of connected the ends so it became a big round lake. With a weird shaped island in the middle, so you have all these other basins or pools connected to the loop. And we worked on it for a year. Then there was municipal elections, like our whole existence as an office was dependent on this project. Then there was some municipal elections, and the majority slided, and the new regime sort of decided to can the project. So our whole sort of livelihood was like swept away out of our feet. At this point, one of my friends had graduated from a computer game designer school, and we got him to turn it into a Counter-Strike level. So we thought, like, if we can't swim in it, at least we can like kill each other in it. But he said a kind of interesting thing, was that in computer game design you don't talk about minimalism or functionalism or deconstructivism. You talk about gameplay, and gameplay is basically defined that it's a cool computer game is not made up, or a successful, enjoyable computer game is not made up of like having like the most amazing graphics, or the most like the most over-equipped enemies or whatever. It's actually a question of trying to balance the need for processing power with to create the sort of the maximum amount of fun. Essentially, to create the maximum amount of fun with a minimum of means. And I think gameplay would be a quite cool ism for architecture, to sort of to measure that when you lay bricks and you cast concrete and you put down some wood boards, that you're actually trying to sort of saturate your designs and the spaces you create with possibilities, so you actually enable a maximum amount of fun or human enjoyment with a minimum amount of means. So in that sense, like, we almost went the other way and like stole some concepts from computer game design and tried to sort of put it to architecture. Because to actually answer the question you asked, I think for us there is no real difference between science fiction and because I think what we do as architects is essentially science fiction, like concrete science fiction. That we try to sort of identify potential innovations, potential altered life forms, or like identify certain subcultures or propensities, and then try to facilitate them and come up with these sort of unusual combinations. I mean, I think the waste-to-energy power plant that we are now building in Copenhagen, that is essentially a power plant that turns waste into district heating and electricity, because it's so big and located in the middle of the city. We propose to turn the roofscape into a man-made ski slope landscape, because we actually have snow in Denmark but no hills. Miraculously, we won the competition based on this proposal, and as a way of sort of creating awareness about our consumption patterns and our carbon footprint, because it's a very clean waste-to-energy plant. The smoke is not toxic, but there's still CO2 coming out of the chimney. We designed it together with this German architect and artist group called Realities United, so that every time there's 100 kilos of CO2, it puffs a giant smoke ring. So if you want to know about your carbon footprint, all you have to do is count the smoke rings in the sky. And when there's like 10 of them, we just emitted a ton of CO2. And I think all of these things would fit quite well in some kind of a psychedelic science fiction novel, but are very straightforward, practical responses to a specific set of conditions in contemporary Copenhagen.
What almost sounds like Super Mario Brothers or something, the smoke ring being emitted into the air. But I'd love to we're coming up to the time, so I'd love to open it up to audience questions, and maybe just while you guys are thinking of a question, I'd love to ask you simply to go back to something that we talked about a long time ago, which was that Ian Banks novel that describes an artificial intelligence attacking a spaceship. And it's just a fun anecdote. I'm just wondering if you just...
Yeah. And essentially, I think it was like it's like a very Inception-esque scene. Like it's the opening chapter of Ian M. Banks' Accession. And I think actually Ian M. Banks is probably the author who best captures this as sort of a successful outcome of the singularity, like Ray Kurzweil's idea about the potential impact of the singularity. I think he actually devised in the culture. But what happens here is that you're following this a drone, like a working robot on a spaceship, and as you're reading, because like it's written very sort of as if the writer assumes that you know the universe that you're in. So like you're following this drone, and it turns out that the drone is like aboard a ship that's being attacked by a hostile mind that's starting to invade all of the different sort of security systems, and then as it's like escaping down some kind of corridor, the hostile mind starts like flicking with the gravity engines aboard this giant ship that is like apparently a spaceship. So suddenly the corridor turns into a chimney, and it starts falling, and it starts like gradually sort of taking over certain of the security systems of the ship that starts attacking this poor drone, and its viruses starts attacking its different levels of consciousness. So it keeps saving its personality, and it's sort of down to like more and more secret or like sort of secure elements of its own hard disk, until it sort of manages to transmit its information to sort of a twin drone that it passes and injects it into space. But so as I was reading it, I felt it was like sort of one of the most sort of mind-boggling three-dimensional sort of explorations of all these different elements that you take for granted in real life, but when you're in a constructed reality, like in a spaceship with a humanly engineered idea of gravity, that suddenly all these elements that you take for granted become variables, and Ian sort of plays with it better than anything I've ever seen.
Any questions in the audience for Bjarke? In the back, Thomas?
I teach one of the housing studios up at GSAT, and it's famously the most difficult, the most boring studio you have to do before you can start to make choices in your life. Kind of the worst studio ever. And all my housing studio students, they love you. And I've been able to read your book in chapters over the shoulders on each of their desks. That's been a strange kind of pleasure. And I'm wondering, especially, you talk about a large-scale constructed environment, and I wonder what it is about large-scale urban housing projects, which your practice has done some remarkable examples of, that interests you in that context, the scale, the repetition, even the boredom of that kind of operation, because it's a nightmare program for a lot of designers and for a lot of students, but you've managed to turn it into a kind of a dream, and I'm interested in what that's about.
I mean, I think what we've tried to do in most of the cases is very simply to identify certain desirable, almost like in a sort of real estate agent kind of way, to identify certain desirable forms of accommodation. Like a house, The mountain is essentially trying to take the suburban house with a garden where your kids can run out and play and enjoy the sunshine, and put it in a dense urban context and give it a penthouse view. So to combine things that are normally completely sort of mutually exclusive, and just like force them together into some bastard child.
Which is a sort of science fiction operation.
Yeah, it is essentially sort of impregnating a known condition with another known condition, but I mean, that's why our comic book is going to be called Bigamy, with a sort of tagline "You can have both." Is that you don't have to choose between one or the other. Like sometimes you can actually really merge, and I think it is it is like really deeply rooted in our DNA. That's how all creation happens, is that you have two, like I wouldn't say mutually exclusive, but like sort of highly incompatible, like a male and a female, they get attracted for some reason, and then they mate and create a third entity that somehow mixes these like diametrically opposite attributes into a new hybrid. And that's essentially what we try to do. Like, with the mountain, it's the townhouses in the urban context. In the project we're doing in New York is trying to take the Copenhagen courtyard and like squeeze it into a Manhattan city block. And in each case, essentially the creative moment is just taking those two extremes and forcing them together. And the design work becomes trying to solve all of the cascade of problems that this forced marriage triggers. And each time you resolve these issues, they generate new kinds of spaces, new kinds of forms, new kinds of aesthetics, and new kinds of expressions. So in a way, it's our role as architects becomes much more sort of practical, sort of exploring the potential of this one innovation, and then sort of trying to see where it takes us.
Unless there's one more from the audience, I think we're going to have to wrap up. But thank you very much, Bjarke. That's great.